Good morning. Well, thank you. Good morning to you. How are you, Deb, this bright morning?
Good morning.
We're one of the nice linguistic tricks that Deb found during our time in Mississippi is that when people asked you, hi, how are you on the street, they actually were starting a conversation. And you had to set aside 10 minutes for that talk as opposed to just, fine, get out of my way, which is the normal rest of the country. So we are in the excited Aspen mode to be able to tell you about a project we've mentioned over the years at Aspen, and this has been sort of a touchstone. Aspen's been a marker for us 12 years ago when we were leaving for China. This was our last stop in the US, and it was our first stop about 4 years later when we came back. And the project we want to tell you about is both exciting to us because it's the subject of this new book we've done, which will be physically on premise in the Aspen campus someday during this week, but makes us think that we have a message that is going to be news to most of the country. Not all members of the country. For example, I see within my immediate eye shot Steve Case, who I know has been making a comparable argument over the last few months from his perspective, but we think is news in the public discourse of our times, actually is positive news and is a kind of angle for how to think in a more encouraging way about the political and civic and economic and other struggles of the years ahead. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do it in the same way that we wrote the book, which is tag team between the two of us. First, I will talk more or less like this, and then
I will talk. I'm the Deb part. Right.
And the Deb part, Deb is consistently, her sections in the book are marked by a little quill pen setting off the sections of the book. If you're listening to the audiobook, which the two of us read over a course of a number of days in a studio in DC, you'll hear the difference quite as rapidly as
right.
quite as rapidly as you will hear. And so I'm going to do a little bit of the setup of what we did and why we did it. Then Deb's going to tell you about a particular thing she found that she thinks is really surprising, and we imagine will come as a surprise to most of you. I will then give you another little layer of sort of big picture surprises of things that might affect the nation's sense of itself that we think differently about than we did 5 years ago. Deb will have another thing she found, and then I'm going to give you the big finish on why we think this matters for Americans and people in the world who care about the future of their societies. And then we'll have time for questions, and we'll all go off into an Aspen day. Is that okay, Deb?
Sounds good.
Okay, that sounds good. So here's the brief setup of what we did, what we know, and why we did it. I have been, as Corby mentioned, I've been a writer for The Atlantic essentially all my adult life. I started working for the magazine, and I first worked for them in my mid-20s and have been an actual employee there for 35 plus years. And the way in which Deb and I have traveled together and done things together usually has been just to go someplace and be in that place for a while and figure out what it is like to be in Japan of the 1980s with our kids in Japanese public school and seeing what that perspective was like, or China over recent years, or Malaysia, or we lived in Seattle, we lived in Austin, Texas, we lived all over the place. So we decided about 5 years ago right now that it was time to do this sort of perspective into our own homeland of the US. And we had a whole scheme, which I'll tell you more about later if you want, and you can read in detail in the book when you get it in your hands, was thinking out the kinds of settlements that we really wanted to know about in more detail were the places that weren't usually in the news except as the objects of something else. When there was a disaster, when there was a concept story, when there was a political campaign, or when these days somebody has a story of, oh, do Trump voters still like Trump? They'll go to a diner someplace and you'll learn that part of the diner in Ohio and Kentucky, but not these cities as sort of three-dimensional entities. So I put up an item on the Atlantic site in 2013 saying, tell us about your city, a smaller city, a city with a problem, a city with a response. Tell us why its story is the American story of this era. We got about 8,000 essays in response to that over the next week or two. We spent about half of the past 4 or 5 years going from city to city to city. I'll say just one or two things more about that, and then you will tell us what we found. So we go to these places. We ended up by the end of the year, these years, having not a scientifically sampled, but we thought representative look at the U.S. We were in every corner of the country. Eastport, Maine. Anybody been up there? You know, that's way as farthest northeast as you can get in Maine. Ajo, Arizona, down in the southwest. All through the middle, we were in Central Oregon and Montana. A lot of time in Central Valley, California. A lot of time in Mississippi and South Carolina. So representative by region, representative by size. We went to a place as large as Columbus, Ohio, just to see what something that big was like. Many places much smaller, and cities that were on different points of sort of the scale of ascent of solving their problems. Probably the one that is, this is a jinx for them maybe, is to say that Greenville, South Carolina may be the city that is furthest up the excellence chain right now in terms of its industrial base, its downtown, its schools, and all the rest. If you're thinking of a place to move, you could consider Greenville, because their official motto actually is, Greenville, are you kidding? When people first hear of it as a place to go, they'll say, are you kidding? And then they go and take a look at it. So we go to these places. We usually spend 2 weeks each in places we wrote about at some length. We began by asking normal suspects, the newspaper editor, the mayor, the school board superintendent, or whatever, who we should talk to. We'd fan out from that, and Deb and I would go see different people. And at the end of a couple weeks, we felt as if we knew at least enough to say, here's what's similar in Greenville to what we'd seen in South Dakota and Mississippi. Here's what's different. Here's how our opinions have changed, and here's where we go next. One of the things we discovered was, from Miss Deb.
Yeah. So a lot of this happened by trial and error when we'd go into a town, especially at the beginning when we weren't quite sure what we were looking for. And after spending a day together, seeing a various number of people, we'd go off in our individual directions. A number of the places that I went were more the softer side of life, the social institutions. Like I went to the public libraries everywhere. I went to the schools, sat in the classrooms, talked with the teachers, talked with kids, went to the recreation departments, always swam at the Y because that's kind of what I do, and I'll see you all at the pool this afternoon. One of the most surprising experiences for me during this last 4 years was the public libraries. I had no idea how much they had changed from my youth when, you go hang out on a summer afternoon, find some books, sit down, find a quiet corner, take your books home. The public libraries today have taken on a role that really is formative in a number of ways. They've stepped up in their mission, not only to lend books, but to fill in the gaps of the needs that are existing in the town, whether it's in education or technology. And they have a real sense of the heartbeat of what's going on in the town. It always seemed to me that the place I would go to find out what the real wants and the needs of the towns were in the public library. And I just wanted to share, some of you may have spent a lot of time in your libraries lately. If you haven't, I encourage you to go there. If you have, some of this will resonate, but there are versions of it around the country that vary from town to town, depending on what's going on there. So this is an institution that's rising, definitely, and very solid in the towns. There were 3 main categories that were of particular interest to me in the libraries: education, technology, and the social and civic life. And in the world of technology, I used to work at the Pew Center, and now one of the things we learn now, was that about 25% of people around the country do not have fast Wi-Fi at home. They just don't have it. That came home to us in Ajo, Arizona, when we used to have to squat outside the public library because that was the only place we could get reliable Wi-Fi feed, because libraries usually always have it. The first thing that you see when you go into public libraries are rows and rows of computers, of laptops, and they're always filled. Sometimes there are waiting lines. Things happen on the low end and on the high end with that technology in the libraries. On the low end, I learned in Columbus, Ohio. One of the main things people go to the libraries to research online are job searches. So I heard the story of this young man who went into the library trying to find a job. And he went to the librarian. She said, sure, we help with that all the time. I'll help you. They sat down at the computer, scrolled around, found a few things that were possible, looked like good choices for him. And she drew up the application on the screen and said, I'll come back in about 10 minutes. You just fill it in, then we'll look at it and see where to go next. She came back in 10 minutes, and he had, do you have a pen? No. He had indeed filled it in. He picked up a marking pen and filled in on the screen the application, which gives you a very real idea of the low-tech needs that public libraries are giving people. How do you start? It was such a basic start. On the high end, it was interesting because if you went in day after day at the long library tables, you could sometimes see same groups of young folks, the millennials, sitting at those tables. Turns out a lot of young entrepreneurs who don't have their own offices, can't afford them, park every day at those tables in the public library to work on starting their businesses. They might take their calls out in the outdoor garden, drink their lattes out there, which are also at the public libraries, but that's where they have a start. And I asked the librarians, do you resent this? I mean, this is their working space. They said, absolutely not. We just hope when they're successful entrepreneurs, they remember where they started, and they come back and support their libraries. On the education sense, just about every librarian I went to ask said, what's the most important thing you do here? They said, it's the children. It's all about the children. It's about preparing those children to get ready to go to school. A man named Pat Lazinski, who was the head of the Columbus, Ohio Metropolitan Library System, when I asked him, well, what does reading readiness actually mean for these kids? He said, when you've got a kindergartner walking into class on the first day, you hand them a book and they hold it upside down, there is no reading readiness there. That's what we do in this library, is try to bring in these kids at a really early age to get them ready to go to school. So in Winters, California, they have a special stroller spotter who goes out. It's a small town. You kind of know who the moms are with their new babies. And she goes out and nabs new moms with babies, brings them into the library, gives them a little box with hats, a little book, a library card, and introduces that mom or dad to all of the events that the libraries have for the little bitty kids to kind of get them used to going to the libraries. The education goes on through high school, where the teachers, the volunteers come and do homework support for kids. The most popular volunteer activity in Redlands, California Library is the adult literacy program, where elderly folks are teaching elderly folks how to read. And in the Bend, Oregon Public Library, a lot of the old timers were a little disturbed at all the hustle and bustle going on in the activities, so they decided that they would open the library an hour early for these folks to come in between 8 and 9 in the morning, so they could have their kind of special time in the libraries. The social and civic life is something that libraries kind of resist having that label of being a community center, but in fact they are. And it's more than the usual things like author talks or a place where you can vote, which we did last week at our DC Public Library, or take ESL classes or do citizenship prep. They also have, in Bend, there are 20 affiliations where people they work with the library works with the Rotary and all kinds of civic clubs to help people prepare their taxes. They bring in counselors for the #1 issue in Bend, which is, how can I arrange my finances to meet my mortgage or pay my rent? So they have special counselors who come in and help the people out in the libraries there. There are the first responders in Ferguson, Missouri, in New Jersey when there were hurricanes, in Houston when the hurricanes hit. The library always stayed open when there were troubles in those towns, as a place where people could not only take shelter, but where the kids could come and spend the afternoons if their schools were closed. And then I'll just wrap it up with the fun part of besides that civic life, at our public library in DC, you can do yoga, you can get your lattes, you can do Tai Chi. And if you go into the Saturday afternoon at the main library, you'll find 70 people doing the tango at 4 o'clock. The newcomers and those who are really good. And it's just a sense to you of what we found of the strength of the public institutions around the country, the library being a surprisingly vital new one.
In the previous issue of The Atlantic, the one that came out just last month, I have a line and a story about our travels in which I say, the point of being a reporter, which is how I think of the way I've spent my life, the process of reporting, I say, is learning what you didn't know until you showed up. And in a way, our whole chronicle in this book is just to tell you things that we hadn't known before we showed up in Sioux Falls or in Columbus, Mississippi, or in Prineville, Oregon, or any place else. And I thought I might give you just a couple of highlights of some of those that for whatever proportion of the crowd might at this moment be feeling skeptical. How could it actually be that you're seeing these positive things in the part of the country we've heard described as a failed hellscape full of bitter and resentful put upon people? How can this possibly be true? Let me give you just as sort of a headline version, a few of the trends I wouldn't have believed 5 years ago and do now. And again, I say, when you get your hands on our book, you'll see that it's written sort of in a whole earth catalog kind of way. You can sort of leaf through and say, okay, if I'm skeptical about this, what are they saying about Nebraska? What are they saying about South Dakota that would fit the model? So here are a few of the things that I wouldn't have believed 5 years ago. I do now, and they're part of the pitch I'm trying to make for the years ahead. The first of them, again, this is one that Steve Case and we have talked about for quite a while, is what we think of as the talent dispersal phenomenon, or the reverse migration, by which I mean the caricature version of one view of American life is the famous Saul Steinberg cartoon from the New Yorker generations ago, of the view from the East River, and you see each of the avenues very clearly, and then there's sort of the Appalachians, and there's a bunch of nothing, and you know that Los Angeles is over there. And I think a lot of the national media naturally treat the country sort of that way, without thinking about it. It's that way, and it's driven by the knowledge that there are certain mega talent centers in the country now. That Washington D.C. has a certain role in politics, and New York in finance, and the Bay Area and Seattle in tech, and there's other areas that have and will continue to have these magnetic pulls for money and for people and for activity. The surprise to us is what a significant reverse tidal flow was underway of people who either had experience directly in San Francisco or in New York or in Seattle or some other place like that, or in London or in Paris, but then thought the overall best calculation and base for my company, for me, for my family is instead in Fresno or in Sioux Falls or in Greenville, South Carolina, or in Des Moines, or in the dozens of other, Pittsburgh, and the dozens of other cities that you could find within the American continent. The U.S. continent is, I think, literally unique in having about 5 or 6 megacities of the kinds we all know, and another 5 or 6 places that would be huge cities anyplace else: Chicago, Atlanta, Denver, Seattle. Then another 100 cities that are of the scale to do all kinds of modern things, and we saw them there. And our book is full of talk about the agriculture advanced tech industry we saw in Sioux Falls and why people chose to do that work there, and the similar things that are happening in Allentown, PA, and all the rest. So the idea, we heard time and again from people that they could have been in Boston and maybe were in Boston, but they felt as if the real estate differential were such and the sense of engagement in a community was such they wanted to be in one of these other places. A line that I quoted and stuck with me was from a young man who moved from the San Francisco area to northern Texas, saying, if you wanted to create, or if you wanted to consume a great community, you could go to Paris, or you could go to Brooklyn, or you could go to San Francisco and enjoy what people had spent decades setting up. If you wanted to create a community like that, You could go to a place like where this guy moved and think that you could be part of the formation of it. So the sense of a diaspora of opportunity and energy and creativity and engagement is different from national news, and we saw that again and again and have lots of illustrations of it. Another thing I think would be surprising is the way that the process of immigration is happening within most of the U.S. now. We know the national rhetoric of immigration now, polarized, bitter, people at odds with each other, et cetera. You probably have seen national polls showing that support for immigration now is as high as it's been within the history of polling. You know, that most people by a strong margin feel that immigration is much more good for the country than for bad, and that the long history of immigration, which is one of the things I've studied, has always been, it's been disruptive whenever it occurs, whether Germans or Irish in the mid-1800s or Eastern Europeans at the turn of the century or Vietnamese a generation ago, it's always been disruptive, but the power of the U.S. is continuing to open itself up. And city by city, that's still what you see going on. Most of the places we went in the Midwest are now either significantly or majority Latino, like Dodge City, Kansas, or Holland, Michigan. And they are finding ways to incorporate this new sense of us in their school system and their civic leadership and all the rest in ways I can mention. Mention another area quickly, innovative schools. I had thought of public schools in the great sort of out there of the country as being another area of probably lag and retrogression and stasis. In fact, every time we went to a town, we said, show us your interesting school, and boy, were there interesting schools to see. Places where young students, Deb will tell you more about that. I'll just say that it was, we were reliably surprised by these schools, especially schools that were addressing the economic problem of this moment, which is people whose parents might have worked in factories. Those factories don't exist anymore, and training the kids for the new technical jobs that do exist. In, you know, if you're a wind repair maintenance person, there are jobs for the next 100 years for you, and in welding and in sophisticated machinery maintenance. This is another big area of job growth, and schools are dealing with this. We saw downtowns reviving themselves across the country, and there's a whole bunch of other things on the list, which I won't give you now. I'll just have one last point before setting up for what Deb is going to say, which is the biggest surprise, I think, was a widespread sense of momentum, by which I mean this. If you've read any story in a national paper over the last 2 or 3 years, odds are it'll say Dateline, Despairville, Ohio, and it'll say, here's the diner, the retirees go in there and life is really bad for them, and they look at the gutted ruins of the factories, and there are these cities and these people across the country now, as there have been in every stage of American history. Our history is of sort of continued churn and disruption. What was impressive to us is how many of the cities thought about their own situation, that they were fully aware of the problems and the drawbacks and the tragedies, and were moving in a direction that felt positive to them rather than being objects of forces that were beyond their control. And we have lots of illustrations of how and when and why, but most places, a final note on this, a BBC correspondent was skeptical when we told him this, a man named Tom Gagan. So he said, I'm going to test this. And he went out for 2 weeks to a town called Blue Earth, Minnesota. The most trafficked item on the BBC site this past week has been coming back from Blue Earth and saying, you won't believe what I saw in Blue Earth. You know, all this stuff is happening in Blue Earth. He's thinking about moving to Blue Earth, Minnesota. So that is the process we went through. Deb.
So as Jim mentioned, when we went to the towns, one of the first questions was, tell us about a school. Where should we go to see a school? And in Greenville, South Carolina, it was amazing. We could have spent every day for 2 weeks going to a different school, but I'll just tell you about one of them. Greenville is a town that lost all its textile mills and is now very heavily industried with BMW, Michelin, GE, and a whole bunch of other big companies, a lot of them very technologically minded. So it was in the interest of the industry and the schools, very progressive public school system in Greenville, to get together. And together they went to one of the most challenged parts of the very central downtown where there hadn't been an elementary school. And they built the A.J. Wittenberg Elementary School of Engineering. This was for little bitty kids, pre-K through grades 4, everything in their little bitty curriculum infused with engineering. And the volunteers, so it's the volunteers from, the day I was there, it was the volunteers from GE who were teaching the 4th graders all about different sources of energy and power. They were teaching them how light bulbs worked. And then afterwards, they would take the 1st graders who were learning about the physics of flight over to the Peace Arts Center, which was a 10-minute walk down the Swamp Rabbit Trail, to see how the stage crews would get Peter Pan up into the air or Wendy up in the air to fly around. So by the time these kids graduated from their 4th grade at A.J. Wittenberg, they went on to the Finney Fisher Middle School. And again, with the cooperation of the companies in town who saw these kids as their future employees, and the cooperation and the collaboration with the school system, they started infusing the arts into the middle school in a big deal way, because they wanted these kids, they said, you know, you've got this engineering stuff nailed, but we want to be sure these kids grow up and learn how to work together, how to speak, how to argue, how to debate, how to collaborate, how to work in groups. And so in the middle school years, they concentrate on all these soft skills. Again, the companies seeing them futuristically as the best possible employees they might want, and the town seeing it as a way that their young kids can grow into full-fledged citizens with lots of skills for their future employment. And it carried on through the high school. So that was just terrific. And then we went on to Columbus, Mississippi, which is in northeast Mississippi, down from Oxford, Mississippi, a place we'd never heard of before. But one of the English teachers emailed us after we'd been writing about schools and said, you want to see a good school? You come to Mississippi and see our Mississippi School of Math and Science. So we thought, okay, we'll fly to Mississippi. There are about 20 schools in the country that are called governors schools. They're public boarding schools for juniors and seniors, supported by public funds, some philanthropy, a variety of things. And in Columbus, Mississippi, they have the School for Mathematics and Science. And they round up kids from the Delta, from the bayous, from double wides, from shacks. They look for kids with a kind of passion in their life who really want to get out of where they're living and hope to create some different kind of future. When you hear these kids talk, there was a young girl, you know, could have been our daughter, from Hattiesburg. She said, I wanted to get out of my school because it was all white and I wanted to have more variety in my life. There was a black girl, couldn't have been our daughter, from West Point, Mississippi, who said, I wanted to get out of my school because it was all black. I wanted to mix and mingle with all the other kinds of kids in Mississippi. So she went to that school. There's one story I'll tell you of a young man named Donnelly Gunn. He was from Columbus, Mississippi itself. He said, I wanted to get out of my high school because it was all about football. Everything was about football, and I wanted more than football. This was a big, strapping black kid. He probably played football for all I knew. When I went into the physics lab there, he was making a homemade 3D printer. This thing was really ugly. It reminded me of people in my hometown who used to try to make their own homemade boats or cars. But it was an ugly thing, and it was just about to work. And it did finally. I thought, you know, how could this happen? This kid makes a 3D printer. He went on the next year on a full Gates Millennial Scholarship to Harvey Mudd. And his dream was to somehow make these 3D printers small enough that you could take them to third world countries and other people could do whatever they did with their dreams with these 3D printers, create stuff, make stuff, ooze stuff out of that stuff that comes out of 3D printers, and make their lives better. And then he would come back to Mississippi and start his, God knows if he's going to do all this, but you know, you're offering this opportunity in the middle of Mississippi to a whole bunch of kids. Some of them will take it, some of them will succeed, some of them will come back. Then there were these career technical schools like Jim was mentioning that are relevant to the place where they are. In Winters, California, which is up at the top of the Central Valley, very agricultural town, half the kids in this town take ag classes, and that means they learn the history and technology of agriculture in California. They have a big garden outside their school where they plant all these, they were planting walnut trees the next, or almond trees as they call them, the next year when we were there. They learn how to maintain and use all the heavy farm equipment. So the idea that agriculture, which is becoming very technical-minded, very modern, also in Winters, California. When these kids are done with high school, they will be so familiar with the industry that most of their parents work in, maybe be enticed to also stay in Winters, California, take over those farms that their dads and moms are working, with a very heavy training, not only in their liberal arts from high school, but also in things that are relevant to that community. So we saw that in all kinds of shapes and forms, depending on the communities that these kids came from around the country. And I can stop right there, and you can go on, because I always tend to get too excited. Yeah.
And I'm also excited, but in a boring old white man way. So this is my version of excitement you're seeing coming through. Yeah. So it's, I am actually excited to be here and excited to tell you what I'm about to, which is the concise conclusion of what we're trying to say. Again, our book itself is structured 95% simply as narrative. Here's what it was like in Central Valley, California. Here's what it was like in South Dakota. Here's what it's like in Mississippi. Things we hadn't known until we saw them, and perhaps you might not be familiar also. But inevitably, there's a message coming through, which is the one I'm about to give you. It's a relevant fact that almost all the places we went to ended up voting for Donald Trump. There are a few exceptions. You know, California didn't, although the Central Valley did. But mainly we were in the areas where that Trump carried in the 2016 election. And you know, after the election, there was this narrative in the public, in the press, oh, if only you'd been out there, you would have seen all this hellscape and hatred that led to the outcome we saw in 2016. And our answer was, in fact, just the opposite. If you'd been out there, you would have seen something quite different, which is this reconstruction of community that's happening in a now disparate way and could use some connection. And so a natural response we've gotten from audiences who are not in the places we're writing about has been, well, how can this be? How could these people have voted for Trump? Aren't you missing their real internal bitterness, et cetera? One reason for our approach is when we went to these towns, we deliberately never asked people about national politics. We didn't say early on, do you like Obama? What about Obamacare? Do you like Hillary? Who are you going to vote for among the Republicans? As the race drew on, we never said Hillary or Obama, or Hillary or Trump, who do you believe? Just because our experience had been, once you asked about national politics, you stopped learning about anything. It was going to be just like turning on cable news. Everybody's opinions would just fit the range of things you had already heard on cable news. And more significantly, you were learning about 1% of the life of those communities. It's a 1% that matters, as national politics actually does matter a lot to all of us in the long run, but it misses the other 90+% of the dramas of people's own families, their own lives, their careers, their communities, their regions, their states. And generally, the sense was in most of those latter narratives, there was a sense of progress rather than regress. And we ended up feeling as if the standard narrative you get from the news these days is it's a time of unique division for the country, unique polarization. There's impossible to agree on anything. It's a zero-sum politics all the way down. I think that accurately describes one layer and an important layer of American life, which is the national political layer, but it grossly misdescribes the rest of the fabric of life, which by and large still functions in ways that you would like to think of American society as operating under, where immigrants and refugees are becoming parts of communities, and where people are able to reason together despite differences in their political loyalties at the national level, and where people can make long-term investments because they think a plan they set for 10 years from now, they'll be able actually to carry that out, as opposed to the continuing resolutions in the Congress that are, that look 1 week into the future, et cetera. And so the reason for our feeling as if we want to tell that now is that we think the narrative, the drama, the history in real time that our country is living through now and over the next generation is between which of these impulses, which of these characteristics in American life is going to prevail. There is a national level dysfunction almost as bad as it's ever been, almost because of the Civil War. But apart from the Civil War, as bad as it's ever been in terms of the way the national government works, and for reasons that you don't have to be of any political party to agree with. At the same time, you have this local level renewal and reinvention and experimentation and crop of leaders coming up, and ways that young people are finding new ways to reknit the civic fabric. When we read texts about the way America has lost the sinews that hold itself together, we think, well, yeah, that's true, but that's talking about institutions that were there 10 years ago. Old bowling leagues might not exist anymore, but there are these 20 other things that have come up in some of these small cities and are holding people together. And so we think this is the social and historical and political battle of the stage ahead in the U.S. of which of these versions of the country is going to make itself known and prevail. And what we obviously hope is that the stories of this part of America and the men and women of different generations who are creating these stories, and that their organizations will be connected, become more prominent, and sort of form the substrate of the next wave of rebuilding at the national level when that becomes possible. It's happened before. There was all the experimentation of the early 1900s that was then available when the New Deal and then the progressive era came into range. So we think that that's what's being rebuilt in America now. We feel as if the people we chronicled are in the process of doing that. They don't know they're in the same team, but we're trying to connect them. And for the foreseeable future, we want to keep learning about them, connecting them, and trying to reknit the sinews of this wholesome part of American tissue regenerating itself with help from recruits from outside the country, and sort of lifting off the scab tissue that now covers it on the top. This is a new metaphor for the moment. Yeah. So essentially, that's our case. If you're out in the middle of the country, you would feel better rather than worse about the way our prospects look. And it's incumbent on all of us to learn about this and to try to magnify the message of people who are doing their best to be rebuilding a healthier country at this time. Deborah, agree or disagree?
Agree.
So with that, we have a few minutes for questions. And yes, Mitzi, so we have microphone runners. So there are two questions here at the front table and then in the back. And then, so how about this microphone coming right up to this front table, and then another microphone goes in the back, and we can proceed in our remaining time. And you can read all about this starting 2 or 3 days from now in the book, or audiobook starting right now.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. Yeah. I'm thrilled to hear this story, because during the campaign, we didn't hear anything about the Middle West. So my question is, are you going to find people to film this so they can... Or are you going to be filming it? I mean, it seems to me you have to have all sorts of ways to share it with people, because they learn in different ways. Yeah.
So can I stop your question there, because I'm so eager to give the answer? So I'm going to stand up to give the answer. I feel an idiot not to have mentioned this. HBO is doing a big documentary based on our book. So we're going to start filming with them. So, and it's going to be, so they're going to get their cameras in the little plane. We're going to be flying into these places. So yes, so thank you for asking it. Yes, HBO will be working with them starting this fall. Thanks, Mitzi. Oh yes.
Did you find any towns which weren't enlightened and didn't have all this innovation and excitement?
Sure, the question is there not a range of activity in the U.S.? Yes, of course. Yes, of course, colon.
This is how Jim talks.
Deb is a professional linguist, as is Deborah Tannen, who is sitting here, so I kind of offer myself as a performing monkey for their amusement. So, point number one, through American history, there's been continued attrition of the smallest settlements. I believe it's the case, and if it's not literally true, it's pretty true, that in every census since the Civil War, most American counties have lost population. Because the Midwest states, they have a whole ton of counties with many small cities, and so there's been this gradual, long-stand killing off of really small settlements. We describe in our book flying along the railroad lines and also I-80 in the Dakotas, where you can see the railroad lines were laid out with towns every 10 miles away, because in the 1880s, that was the economically efficient distance. Now, only about 1/4 or 1/5 of those towns exist. They've become the sort of nodules, and the rest have died off. So, yes, there's been long-term constant attrition of some really small towns. Number two, we went to a number of places that were in really bad trouble, San Bernardino being first on the list. I grew up right next to there in Redlands. San Bernardino is arguably the most troubled city in the U.S. Our point was that even there, the movement they felt was in one direction. They've changed the city constitution. They've gotten, their city schools they view as sort of test beds for new innovations. We went to places in Appalachia where they still felt as if they were only beginning to get traction rather than losing traction. But yeah, there's a whole range of places working and places not working. And we compare and contrast, say, Greenville, South Carolina with Spartanburg, its neighbor. They were on a similar plane about 40 years ago. Greenville's had a better time than Spartanburg. Yes, it's a land of variations, but polls show that something like 75% of Americans believe that where they live is going in the right direction. Everybody feels the country is going to hell, but most people feel where they live is going in the right direction.
And I would just add one thing. In a number of these towns, Allentown, Pennsylvania, Charleston, West Virginia, San Bernardino, Fresno, California, there were these little kind of bonfires of hope. I mean, they were not wonderful towns yet, but they were on their way. You could see it. San Bernardino, I think, was the most dramatic for us, where there was a group of young people in their late 20s, early 30s, calling themselves San Bernardino Generation Now. They were so angry at the naysaying about their town that they wanted to do something about it. So they were a group of artists. They started out in a very approachable way, cleaning up parks, making different nice graffiti on buildings. They started a kind of like little following. The kids would follow them around. Then they started having festivals in the parks with music and cotton candy and face painting and all that, just to get people together. The point of which was to talk about civic change in their town. And they produced these little films about some kind of issue that was happening in their town, like they were going bankrupt, and were taking them into the high school as a way in to talk to that generation of kids and give them a sense of hope and to get them out to vote. So it was this whole plan that this young group had figured out about how to jumpstart at the teenage level the citizens of that town to make that place better.
We just have a couple minutes left, so we can have a couple questions and we can also do talk afterwards. Yes.
I think first, if I may, thank you. I feel not only hugely informed, but very hopeful. Thank you indeed. A terrific start to this session.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
May I just ask, I wrote down widespread sense of momentum. Can you identify what caused that? Was that a particular individual? Wouldn't be the government, I don't think. What patterns did you see make this happen?
So there's a whole chapter at the end of our book trying to answer exactly that question. What are the 10.5 signs of a city that will have this momentum? The half sign is whether it has a craft brew industry, this being a sign of vitality, et cetera. But the other 10 are ways in which there have to be people who feel as if the success and survival of that town matters to them personally, and they are choosing to spend the rest of their lives there. But there are a lot of other ways in terms of the relationship between the government and private industries and how the community colleges have configured themselves and the way that infrastructure investment goes on. So there is, I won't go through it all now, but this is something we have tried to think about, and I'll tell you more offline too.
I'll be the first in line at the bookstore. Thank
Thank you. Thank you. I'm letting the microphone callers just call on the question people. Yes.
I'm from Flint, Michigan, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows about the water crisis, which has been dealt with, was horrific, but is being dealt with. But they're also now building a new auto parts factory in Flint, and that's not been reported on at all. Just curious, how can you encourage your magazine, the popular press, to more regularly, not once a year, once a day, report on these, what I would call an American rejuvenation?
It's, funny you should ask. This is the question that is the forefront of Deb's in my mind right now, because anybody who's worked in the press, as many people here have in one way or another, know that there's only so much good news you can do. It's considered to be boring. There's asymmetrical risk. There's a risk of looking like a sucker if you say something is good, and that's been, we've encountered, so that's a theme I can tell you more about later, but it requires some kind of ongoing vehicle for saying, yes, this is the story of the next stage of America's life. Let's keep seeing the bricks along in the structure of that edifice. During the 4 or 5 years Deb and I were traveling, we had a website in which we had a built-in excuse to say, here's what we're seeing every day in Sioux Falls, here's what we're seeing now in Ajo, Arizona. We need personally, the two of us, to reconstruct some site like that and to work with the many, many other allied figures. The New America Foundation is thinking about this. Rise of the Rest is thinking about it. Bloomberg is thinking about it. Just finding some way to have, to replace what normal journalism just isn't going to do. To have a center where you can make interesting the fact that there is this race to build the different America, and that Flint story would be part of it.
Talk about the idea of the philanthropy.
What?
The idea of the philanthropy and start.
So just one other particular point. A particular point of pain for the country right now is that local journalism is both crucial and under a lot of economic pressure. So finding some ways to rope in philanthropy and philanthropists to the relatively inexpensive job of setting up like fellowships or endowments or whatever, so talented young people could go out and work in local papers like the Peace Corps, like the National Endowments for the Arts. Getting a national endowment for local journalism is a really important thing to get going as one more part of this.
Jim,
yes, yeah.
It's Jim. Deb talked about Greenville, South Carolina. If I can get you to push a little bit further on that, I flew to Greenville last September for a friend of mine's mother's funeral. And there were 1,000 people in a church. Yeah. Greenville is one of the most religious cities in the country. There are more churches per square mile than almost any other city. And I sat there and looked around that church, and I said, these are great, God-fearing people who put religion first. Yet it was my assumption that 98% of the people in that church voted for President Trump. And putting politics aside and going just at character, what did you get in those communities that said that these people could put politics or economics in front of their religion to vote for President Trump?
This is obviously yet another of these central questions of our time. And the answer to it I can give of scale for being at the end of our time for this session is something has happened to unmoor people's feelings about national politics from everything else in life. It has become an almost purely religious issue, it's like identifying Sunnis or Shia or whatever, or a very particular violent version of like soccer loyalties in Europe, where you don't know on sight whether somebody's for Liverpool or Real Madrid, but once they know, they hate each other. And there's something that has made people who in their civic life are open-minded, inclusive, et cetera. When it comes to national politics, they have this tribal, mainly resentment-driven vote. I don't know what has broken the connection that way, and my sense is that figuring out that broken connection and trying to heal national politics is one tier one need for our country. Another, less publicized tier one need is shining light on and connecting this other force in American life. So I agree, this is a really powerful question. I don't know the answer to it. I think that's part of what we need to solve while working on this other front too. I think we're at the end of our time, so we'll need to talk with you, everybody just out in the
We're around all
foyer.
week.
And
Yeah.
we'll be around all week, and within a couple days, we'll have some actual books. So thank you all.